Hello, everyone, and welcome to White Ribbon's webinar on healthy masculinities and healthy relationships. My name is Véronique Church-Duplessis, and I'm the bilingual project manager here at White Ribbon, and I'll be delivering the webinar today. Before we begin, I would like to draw attention to the fact that some of the content that we will be covering today may be triggering for folks. So I've included some numbers of helplines and resources that can support you if you need to chat with anyone, and I encourage you to reach out for help. It's never too late to reach out for help. For those of you who are not familiar with White Ribbon, we are an organization that works with men and boys to encourage them to promote gender equality and to become part of the solution to end gender-based violence. So we provide tools and resources and inspiration so that men can become allies and join the feminists and the women who have been leading the movement to promote gender equality and gender-based violence over the last decades. So today's webinar, we have some simple goals. We're going to look at harmful male norms and how they contribute to gender-based violence and hurt everyone in our society. And then we're going to look at what we can do as educators and adults and role models to promote healthy gender norms and healthy relationships when we're working with youth. So when I talk about gender-based violence, I'm referring to various forms of violence, including physical violence and sexual violence, but also psychological violence and verbal violence and economic violence. All of these forms of violence are being perpetrated as a result of unequal power relationships between genders in our society. They result from gender norms and expectations, and they have a gender dimension insofar as the vast majority of its victims are women and girls and LGBTQ folks. And the vast majority of perpetrators are male-identified folks. And gender-based violence is really prevalent in our society. It's endemic. In Canada, 1 in 3 women will have an experience of sexual assault in her lifetime. In 2014 alone, there were more than 500,000 sexual assaults in Canada. And although the Me Too movement has drawn attention to how pervasive sexual violence and gender-based violence are in our society, there are still some groups who remain invincible and who face higher risks of and higher rates of gender-based violence and sexual violence than other groups in our society. So, for example, in Canada, some groups who have additional experiences of discrimination and oppression face higher risks to experience sexual violence, including young women. So the young women we have in our schools, the girls that we have in our schools, they are experiencing high rates of sexual and gender-based violence. In Canada, women with disabilities and trans women and Indigenous women also have much higher rate than average of sexual violence. Sexual violence also affects men. The vast majority of those who are victimized during their childhood. So we're talking about 1 in 6 men in Canada who will experience sexual violence. But overall, female-identified folks, LGBTQ folks, have much higher rates of sexual violence than men do in our society. When we look at the root causes of gender-based violence, there are 4 main interrelated root causes. The first one being gender inequality and patriarchy. So we have a system that has been in place for thousands of years that says that men are superior and women are inferior, and that idea is embedded in our legal, political, social, and cultural institutions. And even though we're making some progress on that end, it does take a lot of time and a lot of efforts to change that system of oppression and to truly achieve gender equality. The good news is that most Canadian men and boys do believe that women should be equal. Now it's a matter of moving from that belief to actions and reality. Some of the other root causes of gender-based violence in Canada include colonialism and the destruction of traditional family structure and intergenerational experiences of violence for Indigenous folks in our society. Colonialism is inherently a violent system of oppression. And the last two are the ones that we will pay a lot more attention to today, including some harmful aspects of masculinity. So some gender expectations in our society are portrayed as good or even natural, but in fact, they are damaging. So there is nothing wrong with being male or masculine, and not all or even most of masculine behaviors are harmful. But there are such norms and expectations in our society, such as dominance, aggression, self-reliance, and the devaluation of anything seen as feminine that are harmful. There are traits at which point masculinity goes from being something positive to being something harmful. And finally, one of the root causes is social learning. So we're looking here at what we learn consciously or unconsciously about what it means to be, to identify as a man, or as a woman, or otherwise in our society. And with that, we are influenced by a number of sources, including media and popular culture, our community, our schools, our family, and all of these institutions and cultural places that sometimes promote harmful male norms and rigid gender norms. So the good news is that violent behavior is often learned behavior, and it can be unlearned, and we can make sure that it's a behavior that future generations do not learn. So starting by looking at gender norms and expectations, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that in our society, folks are constantly bombarded with messages about how they should behave and what they should do to be considered either a real man or a real woman, including the way they look or dress, the way they behave, the way they speak or communicate, what they like or what they dislike. And these ideas are start influencing folks at a very, very young age, even with babies. These ideas are extremely are already being promoted. So we have to make a conscious effort to challenge those rigid gender norms, not only because it helps folks being more authentic, but because this kind of binary thinking is also harmful because it does not recognize that in our society, folks do not necessarily identify as men or women, and that there are several ways of defining your own gender identity beyond that binary, and that we should really think about gender as a spectrum and make space for diversity and different understandings of gender in our society. So one of the activities that can be done with students in your classrooms or young people with whom you interact in other spaces in your life is the man box activity. So this is one of the activities that we have in the Drawing the Line on Sexual Violence guides that I will be referring to later. The goal of this activity is to take a critical look at gender norms and understand how those contribute to violence. So the first part of the activity is to take a look at the stereotypes to which men are expected to conform in our society if they want to be considered, and I have some quotation marks here, real men. And then to look at the insults that men get called when they do not conform to these stereotypes. And this activity works with young people in elementary school, with people in high schools, and it also works with adults. And we get remarkably consistent answers every time we do this activity, no matter the age group or the cultural background of the students we interact with. So this is typically what we see when we do this activity. The male stereotypes that participants identify quite easily include being successful, tough, being dominant, confident, aggressive, not crying, being stoic, being angry, powerful, strong, being a player, and a provider. So that's the first part of this activity. And it's worth highlighting here that these expectations, these norms, are very often not achievable. It is extremely difficult for a male-identified person to conform to all of these stereotypes, to stay in that box all the time. And we'll see that trying to do so and subscribing to these ideas usually has some very harmful impacts on men. Now, the second part of the activity is to look at the insults that are used to police the masculinity of those who do not conform to these stereotypes. And these are obviously very offensive terms, but what we see, and when we put it like this, is that there are two main categories of, or three even main categories of insults. The first one are the sexist insults that compare the male-identified folks who don't conform to basically to women. The second category are the homophobic insults. And the third category are the ones that refer to what we would call a substandard form of masculinity. So if we're thinking as what is in the box as, let's say, the alpha male, these are kind of insults that we would be using for what sometimes is called a beta male, which is some of the language that is used online at the moment, that language being problematic in itself. But basically, when we illustrate this like that, what we see is that there's already a hierarchy between what's in the box and what's outside the box. So we're saying that what is in the box is superior to all the other three categories of individuals outside the box. And that dynamic is toxic. And it leads to, it can lead to violence. So I have a quote here from a 13-year-old boy who took part in a learning experience that looked critically at gender norms. And this young man already saw the connection between that man box we just saw and violence, particularly in terms of vulnerability and repressing emotions, and being stoic and aggression. So this young man understood that because of all those expectations, including guys shouldn't cry, they need to have big muscles, they can't show feelings, they can't show pain. So if you can't do all that, it's going to build up inside, and you have to let it out sometime. And then we're looking at the type of possible release. So it can be a good conversation, or it could be a bad release where you start a fight with somebody. So there's a clear connection between those harmful male norms and violence. Masculinity is harmful when it is based on the assumption that women and gender nonconforming folks or LGBTQ folks are inferior and that men should be dominant and in control. Masculinity is also harmful when it promotes aggressive and violent behaviors to assert power and dominance. And it is also harmful when it limits men's emotional range, making anger one of the few acceptable emotions for men. And a 2017 study showed that young men who do conform closely to the stereotypes and the norms that we saw in the gender box are more likely to exhibit violent behavior. So young men who try to conform to the man box are much more likely to perpetrate bullying than the peers who are outside the box and don't try so hard to conform to those expectations. Young men who also try to conform to the man box are 3 to 6 times more likely to have perpetrated sexual harassment against women and girls. So those harmful male norms have negative impacts on women and gender nonconforming folks, including discrimination, experiences of violence and harassment, and emotional labor, since if men aren't able to cultivate open friendships with multiple people in their lives, including their male friends, they often rely on their partners, on their mothers, on the women in their lives to do emotional labor for them. So this limited emotional connection between men and the emphasis on self-reliance and the difficulty of getting help when encountering struggles means that girlfriends and partners and gay friends who are seen as better at at being caring and nurturing and dealing with emotions become men's primary emotional support, and that can put a lot of pressure on a relationship. And violence and discrimination are obviously some of the most harmful impacts of these gender norms on women and gender nonconforming folks. Those norms also have negative impacts on men. It is harder for them to be authentic and be genuine. They often feel like they have to put on a mask and put on a show to conform. These norms are also linked to loneliness and poor social skills and a difficulty connecting with loved ones and others. And they're also connected to limited self-care, substance abuse, mental health issues, and higher suicide rates. Substance abuse and risk-taking behavior here being linked to what we see as acceptable behavior for men. If a man is struggling with difficult emotions or a difficult situation in their life, it is not uncommon that they would rely on substances, including alcohol or drugs, to cope with those difficulties. So this inability to get help, to show and display emotions, and to be vulnerable because they're seen as sign of weaknesses do have very harmful consequences for men, including some issues with mental health. Now, if you need a current example to use with young people in your life about the importance of talking about mental health and getting help when things are not going well, you can fall back on Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, who came out earlier in 2018 to talk about his struggles with depression and encourage those experiencing mental health issues to reach out for help and to not be afraid to opening up and being vulnerable. And I don't have it here, but in the discussion surrounding this issue, The Rock also emphasized that doing so, getting help, dealing with depression, doesn't make you less of a man. Another harmful impact of those harmful male norms is that when young boys reach adolescence, it is harder for them to create meaningful connections with their peers, particularly with their male peers. And a lot of men in our society, a lot of men in Canada, experience loneliness as a result of this difficulty in creating meaningful, profound, and supportive connections with other men. So it is important when we're talking and teaching young boys to emphasize this importance of showing vulnerability and opening up and talking about our struggles and our feelings with our friends, and not simply talking about sports and cars and stereotypically masculine things. Now, although these harmful male norms have negative impacts on male identified folks themselves, they also give men certain advantages and certain privileges, which is one of the reasons why these norms are still around, despite their very clearly negative impacts. So in our society, male-identified folks usually have advantages in all areas of our lives, including in relationships and experiences of harassment and violence, in politics, in laws and customs, and moral norms, in the economy, or even in the family. So because we live in a patriarchal system, there is a systematic subordination of women, and men gain economic, political, social, educational, and practical advantages. Now, it's worth remembering that not all men in our society benefit from male privilege to the same extent. Men who belong to other marginalized or racialized groups don't generally benefit to the same extent as those who accumulate various forms of privilege, such as white, heterosexual, cisgender, well-off men in our society. However, despite these advantages, gender equality is not a zero-sum game for men in our society. Multiple studies have shown that men who live in more gender-equal societies are overall happier, they're overall healthier, they're less likely to be depressed and abuse substances, they're more likely to be satisfied with their relationships, less likely to be divorced, and freer to be who they truly want to be, freer to be authentic and genuine. So even though through a male privilege, men gain acceptance from their peers, they gain power and advantages in our society, in the long run, harmful male norms are harmful. They disadvantage men, and there are very clear benefits to gender equality and healthier male norms. At work, more diversity leads to greater job satisfaction for everyone, and for companies it leads to better performance and profits. So studies have shown that gender equality is good for everyone, not just for women, and it's not true that men lose when women win. Now, we have some work to do to promote healthier masculinities in our society. And when we talk about healthy masculinities, it's important to emphasize that it's plural. There are multiple ways of being a man, and there is no need to conform to one single idea of what it means to identify as a man in our society. Overall, we're looking at what makes us good human beings. Healthier masculinities are based on equality and respect. They're based on good communication skills and the ability to practice consent. They are also based on the ability to care and show empathy, and the ability to have good emotional intelligence. And I really think that this is one of the areas where we can do our best work if we want to promote gender equality and healthier masculinities when we're working with boys and young men. It's this idea of emphasizing that all human beings have a wide range of emotions, and it is okay to have and experience all of those emotions, even if they are unpleasant, and even if they are sometimes difficult to manage. And it's okay to be vulnerable. So when we're working with young people to help them develop their emotional intelligence, it's important to go over all three parts of emotional intelligence, including first acknowledging that we are experiencing an emotion. Second, developing our ability to express that emotion. And third, develop our ability to manage that emotion in a constructive way. And emotional intelligence is necessary to help us develop and maintain healthy and meaningful relationships with our friends, with our family, with ourselves, and later on in life with our intimate partners. And sometimes men and boys learn to repress their feeling to such a strong extent that they can struggle with the first step of emotional intelligence, which is acknowledging and accepting that we are experiencing an emotion, particularly a difficult emotion. So what happens when we have trouble dealing with a difficult emotion is that we often fall back on the one emotion that we're comfortable with, the one that we understand, and the one that is socially acceptable, particularly for men. So oftentimes when a person is angry, there is more going on beneath the surface, which is why this anger iceberg illustration is quite helpful. Oftentimes when we experience extremely difficult emotions such as disgust or shame or guilt or embarrassment, it's easier to fall back on anger. Because that emotion is more socially acceptable, and for men in particular, it won't question their masculinity. And anger, when it is not properly managed, can result in violence and aggression. So it is important to help young people develop the ability to deal with a wide variety of emotions, including the extremely difficult emotions that we see beneath the surface here. It's important to develop our ability to manage those in a constructive way, to find coping mechanisms that are non-violent, and to encourage folks to reach out for help when they're dealing with difficult emotions that go beyond their capacity to manage them themselves. Now, developing our emotional intelligence and communication skills is also helpful because it is at the center of our ability to develop healthy relationships. And those harmful gender norms, those harmful male norms that we saw, often make it difficult for young men to establish and maintain healthy relationships. If a young man is trying to conform to the stereotypes of dominance and control and limited emotionality, it will be hard for him to develop healthy relationships with himself, with his friends and family, and with his intimate partners. Now, there's often this idea that we don't need to talk about relationships because people instinctively know how to build healthy relationships, and that's not true. So it is important to look at a wide variety of relationships with young people and help them analyze them critically so that they can recognize the signs of healthy or harmful relationships. And doing so, it's important to build empathy as well when looking at the folks in a relationship. So I've put here a couple of examples of relationships, some of the things we use in our workshop to get young people talking about whether a relationship is healthy or not. And when looking at these, we usually use a bunch of debriefing questions, including if the people in this relationship were your friends, how would you deal with it? Is this relationship healthy or unhealthy? How do you think each person in this relationship feels? And what do healthy relationships look like? And it's important to start building empathy and asking students to think about how the people in this relationship would feel, so that they can pay attention to those feelings and those emotions and understand how a healthy relationship should feel or should not feel. So looking at things like trust and jealousy and control and dominance, and all signs, all warning signs for unhealthy relationships. And basically deconstructing the healthy parts, all the parts of a healthy relationship with your students and with anyone. Basically, anyone can benefit from looking at what the basic parts of healthy relationships are, including the fact that they are based on equality and nonviolence, that they're based on trust and support and non-threatening behavior, that the folks in their relationship feel that they have the ability to make decisions for their own sexual health and well-being. For adults, particularly looking at financial and economic independence, negotiation and fairness, and responsible parenting, and that relationships are based on honesty and accountability and connection with others. Our culture often puts a lot of pressure on relationships and romantic love, pushing this idea that when you find your romantic partner or your soulmate, that person will complete you, and that you won't need anyone else once you've found the right person for you. And that is just not true. In order to be a healthy human being, we need to develop meaningful connections with several people, including people outside of an intimate or romantic relationships. It's important to be able to have friends and connect with friends and family so that we can have a good support network, and people who can help us when things get difficult, and people who can celebrate with us when things are going well. Now, another reason why it's very important to talk about relationships with our students and young people is that we get a lot of harmful ideas about relationships from popular culture and media. The idea that folks are happy ever after when they get together, when they find their soulmate, is just not true. Relationships are often difficult, and they require work, and they require an investment, and it's not going to always be easy. We also have some negative ideas about harassment and stalking and boundaries that we find in a lot of romantic comedies. A lot of them are based on the idea that a man should pursue a woman until she gives in, that they shouldn't take no for an answer, and that is not respecting women's boundaries, and it sends the message that you should basically harass a woman until she gives in. For example, in The Notebook here, which is often held as the epitome of romanticism, the protagonist threatens to kill himself until the woman he's pursuing agrees to go out on a date with her. And that is not the basis of a good, healthy healthy relationships. There's this video from the YouTube channel Pop Culture Detective that looks at stalking in romantic comedies and how it perpetuates very harmful ideas about what relationships are. Another problem with relationships in media is that they're often, particularly in romantic comedies, is that they're extremely heteronormative and don't reflect the diversity that we see in our society. And it's important for young people to have examples beyond what they see in the movies. Now, one of the things that we can do working with our students is starting to promote a consent culture, a culture in which asking for consent, asking for permission is normalized, both in our relationship and in other parts of society. So we're talking about normalizing a culture where we ask for permission, we're also normalizing conversations about consent, what it looks like, what it feels like, and how important it is. And these conversations are necessary because Canadians don't have a good understanding of consent, and we're not only talking about young people here, Canadians of all ages. Only 28% of them have a good understanding of consent. So there is clearly some education work to be done there. So some of the work can be done by looking at scenarios to see if folks are consenting. And when looking at those examples, it's important again to first look if there is consent or not and why. But also to start building empathy by asking your students asking them about how the people in this relationship might feel, and help them think about whether or not this is a healthy relationship, and asking them to think about what they would do if the people involved in this relationship were their friends. So that they understand that if they see warning signs of unhealthy relationships, it would be important for them to act and do something to make sure that the concerns are addressed and that folks in unhealthy relationships know that they have support and can get out of that relationship. So consent, it is both simple and not so simple. When I was young, we used to say that no means no. Thankfully, we've moved away from that definition of consent to really look at yes means yes, but also understand all the parts of that yes. So consent needs to be freely given. A person shouldn't be coerced or manipulated or guilt-tripped into giving consent. It is reversible. Just because someone consented to something at a previous time doesn't mean they were consenting at this time. It also means that at any point a person can decide to stop. It is informed. The person knows what they're consenting to. It is enthusiastic. It is specific, and it is sober. So a person is in full possession of their capacity. They are able to make an informed decision, and they know, they are aware of everything they are consenting to. Now, part of the consent education and healthy relationship education you can do in school is looking at bystander intervention. So bystander is a person who is a witness or someone who is close to an event who may be in a position to intervene and make a difference. With bystander education, we're trying to counteract the ingrained reflexes and tendencies that we have in our society to think that, oh, it's none of my business, or it's a private matter, or someone else will do something. Bystander education is also helpful because it clearly highlights how gender-based violence and sexual violence is not an individual issue. It is not an issue that concerns only the perpetrator and the victim, but rather that gender-based violence is everyone's issue. It's a societal issue, and we all have a role to play to end gender-based violence and support survivors. Bystander intervention education is needed because most people do not naturally know how to respond when they encounter a situation that is potentially problematic. It is not true that everyone is prepared to respond when they see something wrong, that they would know how to act and what actions would be effective and what actions would be safe. So White Ribbon is one of the partners of the Draw the Line campaign that was developed by the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres and Action Ontarienne contre la violence faite aux femmes. And the Draw the Line campaign proposes realistic scenarios to help bystanders think about what they could do in a problematic situation. So the front of each Draw the Line card outlines a realistic scenario where there could be sexual violence. And the back of the cards highlights realistic actions that bystanders can take to intervene safely and effectively when they encounter those situations. So you have two cards here. There are over 35 cards for the whole campaign, so I invite you to visit drawtheline.ca to see all of the cards, which you can use when working with youth and adults to start conversations about sexual violence and its prevention and what bystanders can do to become part of the solution. Now, at White Ribbon, we developed a guide for educators to support conversations using the Draw the Line cards. So it helps you use those cards for classroom activities and implement a proactive sexual violence prevention approach in your classroom and in your schools. It helps you normalize conversations about sexual violence and its prevention and break the culture of silence that often surrounds the topic. So it helps your students understand that you know that this is an issue and that they can come to you if they're experiencing sexual violence, and that you will believe them and support them. The Draw the Line guides are bystander focused, so they focus on what we can all do to end sexual violence, and it engages all students, including boys and young men. And it helps you challenge the myths that still surround sexual violence, and it helps with a scaffolding of learning from grades 1 to grades 12. So younger students learn the basics, including asserting boundaries and respecting boundaries and getting help when things don't feel right and trusting their instincts. And older students learn to understand and apply the concept of consent. They learn about respectful, equitable, and healthy relationships, and they learn to be active bystanders and intervene effectively and safely to prevent sexual violence. So if you're an educator, a parent, or someone who works with young people, I encourage you to think about what you can do to challenge unhealthy gender norms and promote healthier models and alternatives, to help your students develop their emotional intelligence, to help them develop their empathy, to help them develop their understanding of healthy versus unhealthy relationships, and to understand consent. And you can use our Draw the Line lesson plans to do all of the above. You can download a copy on our website at dtl.whiteribbon.ca. We have a number of webinars to complement this one, including a webinar specifically for elementary educators, looking at the foundations for healthy relationships and bystander intervention, and one for secondary educators, looking at healthy relationships and preventing sexual violence in secondary school. You can access the recorded webinars on our YouTube channel or on our website, since they have already happened. Finally, before we conclude today, I would invite you to let us know how we did. Please complete the survey at this link, and we are always looking for areas of improvement, so let us know what you think. And please contact us or share your experience with us on social media. If you have any questions regarding today's webinar, you can contact me at vchurch@whiteribbon.ca. My email address is here, and I look forward to hearing from you. And